Thank you so much for joining us all at the Lam Museum of Anthropology, those of you who are here in person and those of you who are here over Zoom. We are really excited to welcome Dr. Scotti Norman here to speak in conjunction with our newest student curated exhibit, which is Experiences of Colonialism in Latin America, which is in the back gallery. So you have a chance to look at it for those of you who are here. Let's say a few words about Scotti. Dr. Scotti Norman is a visiting assistant professor in our anthropology department here at Wake Forest. She received her PhD from Vanderbilt University in 2019. She's an anthropological archaeologist investigating religious revitalization, indigenous ritual, and the transformation of gender ideologies through the Inca Empire and early Spanish colonial era. She investigates how colonized and often understudied groups, Indigenous and African individuals and women specifically, created spaces of influence and resilience for themselves and their communities in alternative anti-Catholic religious movements. For our Zoom attendees, if you have any questions, please place them in the chat and we will read them aloud at the conclusion of Dr. Norman's lecture. Please help me welcome Scotti.
Sarah. Okay, thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you, Andrew, for inviting me. I tend to have a really booming voice, so if on Zoom, the microphone, turn down your own volume, okay? So I'm so excited to be here to give this lecture in honor of the Experiences of Colonialism in Latin America at the Timothy S.Y. Lam Museum. To my understanding, my good friend and colleague, Carla Hernandez, and the students in her course designed this exhibit. She's one of my very best friends and, less importantly, also a brilliant scholar. So I hope that this talk can really do her and the exhibit and her students justice. It's really exciting to see these themes talked about in a museum setting. Often archaeology of Latin America is typically ignored in favor of other more, exciting topics other places. So I've been entrusted with the complicated and very difficult task of highlighting not only the complexities and vagaries of colonialism in the Spanish Americas, but also more importantly, emphasizing the diversity and histories of pre-conquest Latin American civilizations. So here's where we're going today. First, we're going to talk about a major myth of Spanish conquest. So here I will suggest that conquest occurred not as a, not due to any innate superiority on behalf of the Spanish, but rather due to a series of flukes and historical contingencies in both Central America and South America. Next, we're going to go over the Spanish Aztec War and the Spanish Inca War, also known as the conquests in both places. Then we're going to study the diversity of Latin American cultures in Mesoamerica and South America using the objects in this collection, which are beautifully displayed on this table here. And as the exhibit delineates in its text outside, there were hundreds of indigenous societies that developed in the Americas for at least 2 millennia prior to Spanish arrival, okay? So we don't have a history that starts with conquest. And in fact, I would argue that the terms pre-colonial or prehistoric and historic and colonial era are sort of false ways of dividing Latin American history and ones that are Eurocentric and really flatten the diversity of these cultures. Finally, I'm going to highlight my own research at the site of Iglesia Chayac. That's located in the Highland Andes of Peru. My research is the first and only archaeological investigation of a 16th century revitalization movement known as Taquiancoy. Taquiancoy, that's Quechua. Quechua is the language of the Inca, and it means dancing or singing sickness. So this movement was previously only known through historical records, and it was characterized by this suite of novel and recycled indigenous practices that combined both indigenous and Catholic ritual. And actually, a version of this movement is still practiced today in the same region. And so it's actually an excellent example of endurance of indigenous ritual through colonialism. Now, caveat is that discussions of Spanish colonialism are usually talked about in terms like rupture or change or acculturation or resistance, right? All of those responses require some emphasis on change in indigenous behavior. And while that's valid, I would also argue that we need to think about indigenous methodologies here and think about how indigenous groups persisted or demonstrated resilience in their practices. Do you want to sit down? Yeah. So first, we're just going to talk about the central myth of Spanish conquest here. So this exhibit's focus is on colonialism, or quote, the establishment and maintenance for an extended time of rule over an alien people that is separate from and subordinate to the ruling power. Colonialism is predicated on the ideology of imperialism, which is a discourse that motivates and legitimizes practices of expansionary domination by one society over another. And European colonization, or quote, the act of imposing political domination over foreign territory and people, end quote, of the Americas in the 16th century was undoubtedly one of the most impactful and disruptive processes in human history. It spurred the traumatic and violent emergence of a new global economy. It reshaped indigenous lands and cultural traditions. But the narratives that are taught about colonialism in classrooms often depict it as a one-sided event that wiped out native cultures and was testament to the superiority of European culture and religion. There are two main sources for learning about the colonial era. First, we have documentary sources, as you can see on the left there. This is an example of what historians use as their main data source, right? We actually read that handwriting that looks like wingdings, you know? These are typically written by European soldiers, priests, administrators, and they have a lot of bias in them. This will come as no surprise to anyone, but these documents typically leave out three major groups: poor people, people of color, and women, right? So we're already lacking this big basis for how we can know about the past. So more recently, archaeological studies have demonstrated that colonialism was not this unilateral, acculturative, or resistive process for conquered groups, but instead that European invasion created an entirely new Latin American way of life in which indigenous practices were adopted by colonizers and Andean traditions were entangled with Catholic and European praxis. So we're not talking about one group totally acquiescing to another group here, but an entirely new third space where there's all kinds of new traditions that are influenced by one another. In his influential text, 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest, Matthew Restal debunks several assumptions about how Spanish conquest manifested in the Americas. I'm going to focus on his last myth here, which he calls the myth of European superiority. As he writes, quote, in colonial times, Spaniards sought to confine history by harnessing it to what may be the simplest trope ever invented to explain human behavior, differences between peoples, and the outcome of historical events, the trope of superiority, end quote. 16th century documentation created this trope, justifying colonialism as, quote, a civilizing project, right? One which would transform native pagan barbarians into civilized Catholic servants. These accounts claimed that the Spaniards were supported by God himself, and thus violent conquest was both justified and inevitable because of European superiority. And instead, I will challenge this notion of European superiority and inevitability by comparing the Spanish Aztec War and the Spanish Inca War. The Spanish had two great advantages during their 16th century imperial campaigns: disease and native allies. Diseases such as smallpox, measles, and flu travel much faster than humans. And it's estimated that Native American population fell by nearly 90% in the 150 years after Columbus's first voyage in 1492. With a lack of immunity in these native populations, the majority who were killed around this time succumbed to disease rather than direct violence. But let me first take a step back and celebrate the impressive accomplishments of the Aztecs and Inca, followed by how the disparate native groups that made up both empires were responsible for helping bring about their eventual defeats. And now we're moving to the Spanish Aztec War and the Spanish Inca War. When Hernan Cortes and his fleet of 11 ships, 500 men, and somewhere between 13 and 16 horses encountered the Aztec Empire in 1519, the Aztecs were gathered into 3 allied city-states, into a group of city-states, sorry, who gave tribute to the 3 allied capitals in the basin of Mexico. You can see the yellow there is the territory of the Aztec Empire in 1519. Now, the rise of the Aztecs has been described as a rags to riches saga, originating with a small nomadic tribe called the Mexica, who existed in the north. They migrated to the Valley of Mexico, and they founded what became the capital of Tenochtitlan. Per the Aztecs' own narrative accounts through pictorial codices, like this is the Codex Borbonicus, this sudden rise was due, of course, to the genius and accomplishments of the Mexica. Now, Aztec religious beliefs centered on an idea that the gods sacrificed themselves to benefit humankind, and thus humans had to sacrifice themselves in order to satisfy the gods. It was a reciprocal relationship. This sort of relationship could only be repaid with offerings of human blood and life. There were as many as 200 distinct gods and goddesses, and many of those can be traced back to earlier civilizations like the Maya or Teotihuacanos. So you have this sort of agglutinative religion building on top of each other, right? And this is an example archaeologically of what we find as being sort of a sacrificial knife that would have been used to make these blood sacrifices. Now, Aztec ritual took place on top of big pyramid temples, and they would have had a very vivid impact on people. So I'm sure we've all heard of the heart sacrifice, right? Removing the heart of a living person. This is what is very famous about the Aztecs. But I want you to think about what it would be like to witness this spectacle, see the blood running down the stairs, smell those sounds, and also hear the performance of the singers and dancers that's happening at the same time. Each of these gods had one or more temples where the idol was kept, and then a full-time suite of priests that would sort of lead these ceremonies, right? And they would burn fire. This is an example of an incensario where we might see a priest holding it to hold that fire. Now, as I said before, the Aztec capital was called Tenochtitlan. It was located on a small island in the middle of a swamp called Lake Texcoco. And the Aztecs were incredible engineers. And I want to emphasize this point because I think Aztecs and Inca alike get shortchanged in the literature because they succumbed to the Spanish eventually. They transformed what was a lake. They decided we're going to build our capital on top of a lake, on top of a swamp, right? And so what they built were a series of raised chinampas, like you can see here. These are raised fields. Along with those raised fields they also built a system of dikes and canals. And so travel throughout this valley, throughout this region, was by canoe and boats, okay? So the waterways allowed for this really wonderful ease of travel, but also provided a really good defensible location, right? You can imagine how people on horseback would not be able to attack a city built in a swamp. Now, as the Mexica power grew, so did those of 2 other city-states, Texcoco and Tlacopan. And in 1428, those 3 city-states formed what's called the Triple Alliance. And they did so to secure control over the Valley of Mexico and to expand the empire outside of the valley. They would rule until the Aztecs surrendered to the Spanish and Cortes in 1521. So here with this, I want to point out several gaps in this map, right? Here we've got our Aztec territory, but you can see there are several gaps that were not controlled by the Aztecs. And so those were city-states that never succumbed to Aztec rule. They did not like the Aztecs, okay? So now we have Cortes arriving. He and his forces first land at the site of Chempoala, which is right here. When they land, they meet a friendly native leader. That leader gives them firsthand information about Tenochtitlan. And here Cortes realizes that the peoples of the Aztecs are actually like a little bit pissed off at the Aztecs. They don't want to pay that money, right? They're resentful about the violence that the Aztecs levied on them. Cortes ends up allying with the people of Chempoala, and then they go together, Cortes and his native allies, and march toward Tlaxcala. Now, this is where Tlaxcala is. Tlaxcala was an ethnic group and a city-state that remained independent from the Aztecs even though they lived very deep in the Aztec Empire. So when Cortes and his forces and his new native allies arrive in Tlaxcala, initially those Tlaxcalans resist and start to fight these Spaniards. Eventually they decide it's better to seek a peace treaty and to ally against the Aztecs in Tenochtitlan. We following. So after several days of fighting, the Tlaxcalans are like, you know what, it's not worth it. We will swear fealty to the Spanish King Carlos I. And they then join Cortes on his march to Tenochtitlan. So Cortes now has about 300 Spaniards and at least 1,000 native allies, okay? You can see where this red arrow is, they're moving toward Tlaxcala. So I want to point out here, in these narratives of conquest, they are always told as if it is a foregone conclusion, right? This battle, either at Chempoala, where he meets the natives, or at Tlaxcala, had the Tlaxcalans beat Cortes and his small amount of men, we could very well see a present-day Mexico that is run by Tlaxcalans or Aztecs, right? It's a historical contingency. On November 8th, 1519, Cortes meets the Aztec king, Moctezuma II, on the causeway into Tenochtitlan. They exchange gifts. Now, as we talk about in our anthropology classes, gift exchange can mean many different things, right? So for Moctezuma, it was likely an act of embarrassing Cortes, right? Look at all my riches. I am giving them to Cortes because I can afford to, because I am wealthy. On the other hand, Cortes is like, he loves me, bring it, bring me all the gifts, I'll take them, right? Moctezuma II then leads Cortes and his men to a palace within Tenochtitlan, right? They are coexisting. They live together for 7 months, the group of Spaniards and the group of Aztecs. The Spaniards are surrounded by Aztecs, okay? Here is another point where conquest could have easily gone the other direction. Now, in this time, they are doing manly things as men will do. They're feasting, they're gambling, they are enjoying more carnal pleasures together, right? And Cortes is also very sneaky. He's using this time, he's going to the tops of temples. He's trying to see the defensibility of the settlement. And he's strategizing during this whole 7 months. Yet all good things must come to an end. Eventually these two groups grow weary of one another and were filled with mistrust. At the end of June, Cortes goes to Moctezuma II and he says, look, things are a little tense. I need you to talk to your people. I need you to calm them down. Moctezuma II climbs to the top of a temple. Something happens. There's a skirmish. Moctezuma is killed, okay? Chaos erupts in Tenochtitlan. Cortes is so scared. He's like, you know what? We gotta go. We gotta go. Let's go right now. He gets all of his men together and he says, get all of the gold and all of the treasure you can. We got to get out of the city. So the Spaniards do, they load themselves up with gold and treasure and then try to navigate the waterway canals on the way out of the city. What do you think happens to them? They drown. Lots of them drown, okay? So the Aztecs notice the Spanish leaving and they begin to counterattack them with swords, with spears, with rocks. By the end of the evening, 150 Spaniards had been killed, along with over 2,000 native allies. Again, I will point out another place where conquest could have gone the other way. Cortes retreats back to Tlaxcala, where he's going to lick his wounds, wait for reinforcements, and plan his siege of Tenochtitlan. The Spanish return to the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1521. They've made new alliances. They have reinforcements. In the meantime, the Mexica, the Aztecs, could not rally anybody to support them, and they had also been severely damaged by smallpox ravaging through their city. On June 1st, 1521, Cortes and his 1,000 horsemen and infantry, along with native allies in the tens of thousands, return. They surround Tenochtitlan, and they basically do a siege of the city. They starve and they prevent all the fresh water from coming into the city. And it's finally on August 13th, 1521, the Aztecs surrender. They don't have food, they don't have fresh water. So they give up their city. Now, The point I am making with this siege saga is that it was never inevitable that the Spanish would ultimately defeat the Aztecs. And there are several points in this timeline in which victory could have been had by the Aztecs over the Spanish. I'm now going to shift to the Inca Empire at the time of conquest in what is today Peru. And often the question that is framed, or that is used when framing the Inca conquest is, how did 168 Spaniards bring down an empire of millions? Okay, you can see the bias laden in this question, right? It's already suggesting some sort of innate superiority for European forces. The story that is less often told is that when Francisco de Pizarro and his Spanish 168 Spaniards enter Peru, the Inca are in the middle of a civil war between two brothers, Huáscar and Atahualpa. Atahualpa, shown here, he's the king of the north. Yes, like Game of Thrones, king of the north, king of the south there, that's Huáscar. So why are they fighting? Because in 1528, the previous Inca leader, Huayna Capac, died of smallpox. So remember what we're saying about disease, right? This disease strikes before the Spanish get there. Disease takes out the major leader. Now, the Inca had no clear heir to the throne, so that means these two brothers started fighting. The Spanish captain Pizarro and his, again, 168 Spanish soldiers and priests make their way to Atahualpa's capital in the north, in Cajamarca. And on November 15th, 1532, there comes a showdown. So Pizarro and his priest, Friar Vicente de Valverde, they meet Atahualpa in the plaza. Atahualpa has 6,000 unarmed Inca with him. The Friar Valverde gives a Bible to Atahualpa. Something bad happens. We don't know what happens. The Bible ends up on the ground. There are several narratives that talk about this. In one narrative, Atahualpa throws the Bible on the ground. In another narrative, it slips. In another narrative, it's a misunderstanding, right? This act, though, was deemed a rejection of Catholicism, and Pizarro then attacks. This is justification for the attack. It begins the Battle of Cajamarca. The Spanish use cannons and gunfire on the unarmed masses of Incas, and the Inca lose some 2,000 people. Atahualpa is also captured during this battle, and Pizarro puts him up for ransom. So while in captivity, Atahualpa, not perturbed about Pizarro, Atahualpa is like, I'm still worried about my brother Huáscar. Atahualpa has his brother Huáscar murdered from his jail cell. Okay, in retrospect, perhaps not the best move. This leaves the Inca with no heir again, right? So again, a point when this conquest saga could have turned. Had Huáscar stayed alive, he could have rallied the forces in the south, right? Pizarro demands that the Inca fill a large room with gold and silver and riches as ransom. This is the actual room. Okay, we see that archaeologically, we know what that is. You can see the dimensions here. And the Inca are basically like, no problem. They collect all of this gold and silver from Huáscar's shrines and they fill it. But Pizarro, not a man of his word, still orders Atahualpa to be executed in 1533 and executes him in Florida. Oh, wait, sorry. I knew I shouldn't have put on the jacket. So the Spanish are benefiting from this fratricidal feud, right? They come in the middle of a civil war. It works to their advantages. And they also ally with non-Inca groups who are, again, like the Tlaxcalans, right, disillusioned with Inca rule. While the Spanish quickly subdue the Inca, their physical and spatial control over the massive empire takes decades to solidify. And the premise of this colonialism was evangelization and conversion to Catholicism. It was never fully realized in an exact replica of Spanish Catholicism. Just a little bit more about the Inca. This is the Inca territory. It's called Tawantinsuyu. It means land of the four Suyus. They divided their territory into four sort of reciprocal parts. They had an empire that expanded 4,000 kilometers over Western South America, facilitated through governmental policy and things like the Capac, which is their major road system there. So like the Aztecs, the Inca are also brilliant engineers, right? They're very well known for their very fancy stonework, as you can see in these examples. The Inca originate in Cusco and spread from there. They bring people into their empire through militarism, coercion, or convincing. And the last part I want to say about this is that for the rest of the talk, I will be referring to Inca and Andean. These are not synonyms. Andean is the name for people who live in the Andes region, and Inca is the specific name of the group that starts in Cusco and expands outward, bringing people into the empire. So similarly, Inca and Andean religion are not the same, but they are both centered on what are called huacas. Huacas are the name for local landscape deities that are venerated by both Andeans and Inca. These could be really anything, any sacred thing. So villages, mountains, canals. There are some stories that's like, we saw a weird corn cob, it's a huaca, right? There's an interesting stone, it's a huaca. Twins, people who were born as twins could be huacas, okay? Very fluid, not like our sort of sense of religion. So the Inca religious strategy then, as they're conquering people, they say, you know what, you can keep your local deities, just also venerate ours at the top, okay? And so that's what you have here. You have Viracocha, the androgynous creator god, Inti, the male sun god, and Kia, the female moon god. So the remaining lineages of the Inca, after they're defeated, after Atahualpa is killed, they retreat to the jungles at Vilcabamba. Now, conquest is not over by this point, okay? The Incas still survive and are still planning attacks until the 1570s. So they're sort of holed up out here in the jungle, gathering weapons, preparing for the next battle. So I will return to this point later in the talk, but the point of these two rather long anecdotes is that neither episode of conquest was inevitable, nor were Spanish forces in any way more talented, smarter, or superior to their native counterparts. The Aztec and Inca both built on societies that came before them to develop these extensive empires in very rapid time spans. And we know with any empire comes along with it those polities who are unhappy or resentful of the governing body. Does it sound familiar to what is happening now in the United States, right? So the Spanish are able to exacerbate those native tensions to their advantage in both places. They were merely the last intervening empire in both Central and South America, and they were lucky to have inherited millennia of planning and infrastructure. All the while they were being challenged by ongoing native ritual practices. So it's to these ritual practices and specifically some of the objects in the exhibit that I now turn. So first over here, I don't know, can you see this okay, sir? I can lift it if you want. Okay, all right. This makes me very nervous. So first we have, this is the a Veracruz figurine. It's from Veracruz, Mexico. It's related to these here that are called smiling figurines or Sonrientes. Now these are probably used in ritual and their gender is debated. They're often found in burial contexts, okay? But you can see their faces are very unique, right? They're all smiling. Some of them are triangular. It's unclear what gender they are. And so archaeologists have hypothesized that they are androgynous, they are male, they are female, or that they're children, right? They've got little chubby cheeks. We don't know their age. Another interpretation is that perhaps these are people, these are spiritual leaders who are taking hallucinogenic substances. And that's actually probably true. This is a theme that's going to run through all of these religious ritual figures, right? The last interpretation of these is that they might have been performers. So these are really the two parts I'm going to touch on throughout the rest of this talk: performance and hallucinogenic or alcoholic consumption. So next we have a very different vessel. Do you want me to hold it up again? Okay. They told me I didn't have to use gloves, so we're not. This is a Moche warrior stirrup spout vessel. You can see the stirrup spout here, very definitive, right? Look at the face of this Moche person though. it's much more individualistic, right? This could be a portrait, not my portrait, but a portrait. Now the moche, prominent from 200 to 850 CE, they're famous for the mass production of those vessels, typically by molds. They're also more infamous for moche sex pots. They're more tawdry companions. You should Google it. I will not talk more about it. But when we're contrasting the moche stirrup head vessel with the Veracruz figurine, we can see some major differences. First is that this is clearly an individual, while these appear to be some type of office, some type of religious figure, not an individual person, right? The moche vessels are typically larger, and almost all of them show adult men, okay? So we have a gender there. Now, let's move on to the Inca Rebolo that we can see here. I don't want to lift this one, it's too pretty and close to what I study. We can see very clear differences in the ritual practice here, right? This is some sort of shaman or religious specialist. We've got individual warriors here. This has no individuality at all. There's not even a person there. This is very characteristic of Inca representation. You have patterns, you have symmetry, you have fine lines, right? This is a representation of the state. So this is Inca artwork showing from Cusco, this is what the state produces. Let's see. It has a pointed base, hard to see there, but you can see it here. So it would have stood upright in the sand. It also has this nub here. You could attach a string around that nub to carry it on your back. And what these were used for was carrying chicha or maize corn beer. Maize corn beer was used in every religious ceremony that the Inca did, every state ceremony. It's still drank today. It is okay. It tastes okay. Okay, so we've got these four displays. We've got the smiling figure, the moche, right? We've got the Inca vessel there. All of those are used in indigenous ritual to some extent, although they all look very different. But with each of these objects would have been a lot of performance and consumption of either hallucinogenic or alcoholic substances. So as the Spanish spread throughout Central and South America, they're attempting to instill a new religious ritual, Catholicism, right? So Catholic practice ended up taking its own forms in the Americas as it becomes entangled with ritual practices like these. And so an example of entanglement that we have in this collection, which I think is really beautiful, is this polychrome bowl. Okay, this dates to the 16th century and was produced by the Mixtec. So what you can see here is a very classic form, right? You've got the tri-legs. This is very classic Central American form. But the pattern here, am I scaring you? Okay, this is like an arabesque Spanish pattern. Okay, so what you have is an indigenous vessel form while they're incorporating Spanish artistic traditions. Okay. And finally, we get to my research. So, like the aesthetics embodied by that polychrome bowl, native religious practices are also entwined, combined, and changed with Spanish ritual. So we're going to turn to now my case study of Taquiancoy. The justification for Spanish conquest was, at least in name, the mass conversion of native peoples and thus the salvation of their souls, right? However, it might come as a surprise, the Spanish didn't really have a plan once they won certain battles, and so they were kind of winging it after that. They were negotiating governance on the ground, collaborating with native groups, right? As a result, different religious orders varied to the extent that they incorporated or prohibited native religious traditions, and especially dance, into Catholic rites. So prior to Spanish arrival, costumed and choreographed dances made up a central part of Andean and Inca performance. You can see this is a festival to Inti Raymi, which is the sun god that still happens in Cusco today. You can see what they're wearing, right? Standardized dress for the men and women. So these are ethnic representation. It began with ethnic representations of the self for Inca rulers. So that is If I were performing for an Inca ruler, I would dress in the typical things from UCLA College, right? I would wear the hat, I would do the dances, I would sing the fight song of UCLA and thus represent myself. With Spanish colonialism, however, the subjectivities of the dances shifted so that the dancers soon started to present the other, okay? So if that's the case, I would be imitating a Wake Forest person, right? I would put on my dapper polo. I might wear, what's our mascot again? I might become a deacon, yes. I would perform as the other. And so we can actually see this process taking place in this wooden mask, right? So this is from, I believe, what, the Maya region? Yeah, and so what this is a mask of a conquistador, right? That an indigenous person would wear during performance. They are representing the other in this performance. 4 for 4 so far. Okay, so in these first 2 decades, of Spanish colonialism, these dances are variably incorporated into Catholic rites. So the Spanish also had a tradition of Christian dancing. And so initially they're like, sure, people in the Andes, you can keep dancing. They view them as a crude mimicry of Christian dances, essentially. But they let them happen, especially on important religious holidays like Corpus Christi. But Spanish authorities soon recognized that dancing was very important to groups prior to conquest, right? And thus it represented something they didn't understand. In 1551, public displays of Inca religious practice were banned in Peru. And as a result, Andean dances, which were once performed in public spaces, were relegated to new spaces that were hidden, that were invisible, right? They were secret rituals, essentially, performed in locations hidden from Spanish authorities. So for Andean and Spanish groups at this time, the meaning of dance becomes contextualized. When it's performed in Catholic spaces or with Catholic authorities, it is okay, it's allowed, it's a representation of Catholicism. But when they're performed outside of the view of Spanish authorities, they become idolatrous, as thought by Spanish clergy. Okay. In the 1560s, remember where we left off, our Inca have retreated, they're in Vilcabamba, they're scared, they're gathering weapons. At this time, a small group of traveling preachers, I know you're on the edge of your seat here, leaves Vilcabamba, travels throughout the highlands. They are the religious counterpart to this militaristic movement. They are advocating for the rejection of everything Spanish, Catholicism, food, dress, in favor of a return to indigenous Waka worship. This is what Taquiancoy is. Taquiancoy practitioners believed that their Wakas had suffered affronts by both Spanish and local people, right? They had neglected their own deities. The deities were really mad. Thus, they were rising up. They were forming armies, and they were going to band together and defeat the Catholic God, thereby returning the Andes into this perceived time of utopia prior to conquest. I consider this to be, is that me? Okay. I consider this to be a revitalization movement. I'm not going to get into that theory now, but we can talk more about it at the end of the talk if you want. But just to delineate some of these Taquiancoy practices, the Wakas were reanimated. They were flying through the air. They were inhabiting people in spirit possession. Those people said they had been purified by that possession. The people who were possessed would ritually drink chicha. Remember the chicha corn beer stored in the Inca rebolo. They would ritually drink that. They would fast. They would not eat salt. They would not have sex. Once you have, fasting for a long time, then drinking heavily, it would put people into a trance state as they're dancing, as they're chanting, okay? And they would dance and chant in these specially built outdoor circular enclosures or plazas. They also rejected Spanish tradition, as you can see by my very clever graphic here, right? Foods, clothing, church, prayer. They also reused indigenous practices that were common prior to conquest, red face paints, sacrificing of cuy, English, guinea pig, and llamas. And they would do ancestor veneration. I should also say, those dance stages that they created, they would sweep clean, okay? So it's about cleanliness, it's about purification, right? They've been ingesting Spanish goods. It has made people sick. They don't want those goods in them anymore. Finally, they would remove burials of Andean peoples who had been interred in the churches, okay? So the Spanish made a law early on that baptized people had to be interred in the church under the church floor. Everybody also had to be baptized, right? So in this dark of night, Andean peoples would go, dig up the church floor, remove their ancestors, and bury them elsewhere. The final practice we have here, burial removal of those Andeans interred in churches and outright rejection of Catholicism. So literally, there's an anecdote where somebody says, I destroyed the cross because the cross has not talked back to me, smashed it with a stone. So Takiankwe, this is a nod to my linguistic colleagues, consisted of performances or standardized acts which follow cultural scripts, and performatives or semiotic acts that do or can make a change in the world by their execution and reception. I'm getting nods from the linguist. So an example of a semiotic act is, I pronounce you married. You have changed the state of those people in front of you, right? So for the Takiangos, when they are dancing, when they are chanting, when they are in their trance, they are not acting like deities, they become the deities, they are the deities, and thus they could be venerated like deities. So these movements are not just associated with anti-Catholic idolatry, but for performers, they are literal embodiments of Andean religion, deliberately undertaken as a challenge to Catholicism. So as a spectacle, Takiankwe would have drawn the attention of local participants and observers, and Spanish authorities were very worried, right? Now, how can we study something like dancing archaeologically? I think your class asked me this today, right, Izzy? So just here too, I want to say, this is Wamampoma. He's a native author who writes in 1615. He draws 400 pictures. This is a depiction of Takiankwe. What you have is the Waka deity inhabiting the Andean individual who is then sick, right? He's been in a trance, he's sick. Meanwhile, the women play drums, they keep the beat. So I would argue that archaeology is well suited to consider things like dance, because we can look at the spaces, the materials, the costumes, all that kind of stuff. So prior to my research, Takiankwe was only known through Spanish accounts. That's where we get info about the practices. In one of these accounts from 1588 by Bartolome Alvarez, he writes that the adepts, quote, danced in groups, raising and lowering their legs and arms in a vigorous stationary march with clenched fists, moving their heads from side to side and making a high-pitched sound, ooh, 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 ooh. That's our only description of the dance itself. But how can we study it archaeologically? So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to integrate historical documentation with my excavation at Iglesia Chayac. Iglesia Chayac means church over there. I love that. It is descriptive. It is perfect. This is located in Ayacucho, Peru. Iglesia Chayac was a Takiankwe center. We know that people were doing Takiankwe here. It was an Inca to early colonial period site, so 1440s through the 1570s. It's a residential and administrative site in the Chichasaurus Valley. It was founded in the 15th century, and it's spatially centered on two structures that you can see here. This is a church, a Spanish church. It's 33 by 9 meters. This is an Inca administrator's house. It's 14 by 11 meters. And I should have put a close-up. That fancy Inca stonework that they're famous for, we actually have on the accessway here. And it's like our rural Machu Picchu. So there are 91 structures total. They're built in 3 different forms. You can see their preservation. It's very good. The forms suggest that different groups were living in different places. We have ovoid, rectangular with these squared corners, and rectangular with rounded corners there. I think I'm sort of running out of time, so I'm not going to go too much in detail about that. But most importantly, for the themes of religious performance that we've been talking about, there are two prominent open spaces at this site. The first one is the central plaza, right? So here we've got our big Spanish church. This is the plaza here, looking north, okay? This is the Spanish center of the site. This is where things like baptisms, prayer, funerals, church masses would have occurred. It's the most visible place at Iglesia Chai. You can see the center point from everywhere around the site. Conversely, we have what I call the local plaza here. This plaza is invisible to the Spanish religious center. It's circular, it's constructed into this hillside. You can see the walls abutting this big boulder, right? And it's consistent with these semicircular enclosures specifically designed for Taquiancoy. So in my excavation, I created a bunch of hypotheses based on what we knew about Taquiancoy from the documents. I'm not going to talk about the church burials here today. I didn't want to show any human remains or anything, but we can think about domestic households and space and performance. And so my main hypotheses were, if Taquiancoy practitioners were rejecting Spanish culture, we should see an absence of Eurasian fauna and households. So people are going to be avoiding the things that Spanish brought, which are cow and pig and wheat. Next was space and performance. Taquiancoy was very highly punishable, and so we would expect it to be in a low visibility space. The way I think about this is like prohibition. You don't see, has anybody been to a speakeasy, right? Or know what a speakeasy is? You have to go behind a curtain, you have to say a secret password and like knock 3 times. That's where these would have occurred too, in hidden spaces, right? Where they couldn't be seen, they couldn't be punished. In those spaces also, we would see things like ritual cleaning and perhaps evidence of chicha consumption. So in 2015, oh, that feels nice. In 2015, I directed the Proyecto Arqueológico de Taquiancoy. We use a lot of community archaeology. I'm happy to talk about that at the end. We brought donuts from the airport. And we excavated 19 units of 4 different types. You can see them here in red. 10 households, 5 patios, a central plaza unit, and 3 units in the central church. So generally, excavation results demonstrated continuity in domestic households, some instances of entangled material assemblages, which is where we see objects of Spanish origin and objects of Andean origin in spaces used by both groups. But our excavations into public areas identified spaces used for dancing. And I guess in our excavation of church burials, we found this crazy array of burial types that show that people were both embracing Catholicism, rejecting it, and practicing Taquiancoy. Specifically, we found 3 cases of burial removal where people went in, dug up their ancestors, and took them elsewhere. Okay, so let's look at the spaces. Did we find a dance floor? That would be great, right? We know from the documents that Taquiancoy dances were undertaken in outdoor enclosures that were cleaned. I think that the local plaza is one of these spaces. We excavated 2 units here. These are all of the ceramic we found in those 2 units, okay? You can see how big and impressive, especially compared to these things the museum has, right? So what does that mean? It means that people are either doing very different things in this area or that it's been cleaned. Either way, the hypothesis is supported, right? Just a note too for Paul, the other archaeologist here. We didn't find any lithic debitage, no evidence of hearths, no faunal remains, nothing, just these 2 ceramic sherds. In contrast, excavation here, in contrasting this with the other outdoor spaces that we excavated, those all had a normal assemblage of ceramic and stone and all kinds of stuff. So additionally, this plaza was invisible to the Spanish ritual center of the site. This is a view shed analysis I did in ArcMap. This is a fancy way of saying the dark blue area is visible, the light blue area is not visible, okay? Here's our local plaza. I measured visibility from each of these doorways from these structures. You can see that none of them can see this local plaza, Okay, so it's hidden from view. So it's likely that Taquiangos sought a different space for their performance, one that's invisible and sort of hidden. And now the results from our household excavations. So here we can see we excavated 10 domestic households. The like too long didn't read part of this is all of our European goods, so animals, iron, right, are mostly found around this church, okay? So in the local households, no evidence of Eurasian goods. That can mean two things. First, it can mean that those households just didn't have access to those goods, right? We don't really know. It can also mean, and this is where you invoke queer theory a bit, that people are making active choices not to incorporate them. Both of those interpretations are valid, and so I will put them both to you here without arguing a lot for either one. Could also be that domestic houses are a place for continuity and family. They didn't have surveillance here, so it could have been a space for agency or resistance. Like I said, we did excavate in the church. I just put this picture because it's cool. That's me, it's my team. This is the altar, right? The 3 steps there. Okay, I'm almost done, Sarah. So what can we say about the endurance of Indigenous ritual and Taquiancoi? Taquiancoi's main practice was dancing. This is a direct revival of those dances performed by ethnic groups under the Inca Empire. That's one way in which the ritual endures, right? They also repurposed traditional practices, red face paints, costumes, sacrifice of animals, ritual drinking of chicha corn beer, again, that we see in the vessel, the aribolo there. But we also know that Taquiancoi was entangled with Catholic practice. This very notion of rejection is sort of a Catholic influence, right? Because Native religion is typically agglutinative. That is to say, it would have been very risky for Andeans to say, I don't believe in the Catholic God, because that God was very powerful during the conquest, right? So that notion of rejection, actually a Catholic notion. Now the archaeological data shows both continuity in daily life along with some aspects of religious ritual, but they're in new spaces, right? They're hidden from display. And then it also is a movement that has influence of Catholic Church and embracing of some Catholic religious practices in its exclusionary nature. Finally, I come to the last object here. Let me turn around. This is actually a ceramic house from Quinoa. Quinoa is one of the closest cities near the site that I work at. This red and cream, these are traditions from the Wari ceramic tradition, which is around 1000 CE. But you can see that you have these ceramic traditions, but in a form that's the Catholic Church, right? So this is an entangled object. Okay. All right, so just to conclude, let me try to wrap up this sprawling anti-colonial talk. This was a new genre for me, so I feel like it's a bit all over the place, but we're going to tie it together brilliantly here. So this experiences of colonialism in Latin America exhibit emphasized several themes, namely that there was great diversity in Latin American civilizations prior to conquest, which we can see again in the Veracruz figurine, the Moche stirrup vessel, and the Inca aribolo there. And that Native groups incorporated or retained Indigenous practices throughout colonialism. I've tried to show how conquest was never an inevitable project, and that European forces were not superior, but that they were abetted by disease and Native allies. And I've shown how Native ritual practices were diverse in their material objects, but also had several similarities, like the use of alcoholic substances and the emphasis on performance and dance. So to return to the title of this talk, The Endurance of Ritual in Latin America, I suggest that Taquiancoi reincorporated traditional Native practices of dancing, chanting, and ritual consumption of alcohol in new hidden spaces as a means of resisting Spanish religion. Iglesia Chayac was a town in which Catholic performance and Taquiancoi performance coexisted, and yet the places where they existed were different and deliberately selected. I will say too, in terms of the endurance of Indigenous ritual, This is a movement called Danza de las Tijeras, scissor dancers. This is interpreted to be the same, a direct descendant of Taquiancoy. It's practiced in the same region. It is a marker of indigeneity. You can see the elaborate costuming here, right? We also have, this is the most famous Quechua trap singer. She's from Ayacucho. She has a song called Tijeras, which is a deliberate invoking of Taquiancoy and the scissor dancers here. And just to wrap up with future directions, I'm currently working on studying the women in this movement. So the women were leading it. They would deliberately change their name to Maria or Magdalena, and thus they would embody both Catholic saints and indigenous wakas. And so they gained a lot of status and power this way. They also controlled the domestic sphere, so what foods could be eaten. They also were responsible for making the chicha beer. So they're involved with a lot of aspects of this. And I think we are just about out of time. So I want to thank Sarah and Andrew again and the Timothy S.Y. Museum, and I will end it there. Yes. Yeah, that's a good question. I have an image of it here if you don't mind me looking for it. So these are some of the graves we excavated, right? This is one. Each of these was its own locus, and it just it was like very, very cool excavation. I'm just gonna, okay. So the removed burials, we were excavating these pits basically. The soil matrix was very different from the surrounding matrix. So this was really hard. It was like excavating concrete. This part of your trowel would just fall into it with all of these burial loci. And when we got down to it, we would find either only distal bones, so like the edge of the fingers or toe bones. Those are the first to fall off when you remove a body. So we would find that. In one case, we found they had deliberately brought rocks to fill the void. So it gives evidence of the agency, right? They planned ahead, they brought the rocks, they filled it back up. Yeah, I'll present to our class more of the burial data when we get there. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. We put a 6x6 unit in the center of that plaza. A thing I didn't talk about was that some of the punishment for Taquiancoy involved Spanish priests destroying their wakas in the middle of the plaza. So we actually did find a statistically significant amount of this foreign stone destroyed in that plaza, which could lead to evidence for that. But with that was also sort of a normal scattering of ceramic as well. So does that answer your question? Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.